Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The autumn of 2023 proved to be remarkably wet, even by the standards of a foggy Britain. Raindrops, cold and heavy, did not merely fall from the sky. They seemed to be attempting to hammer their way through the glass of the Hogwarts Express, tapping out a rhythm that sounded like the scratching of 1,000 tiny glass claws. Jasper Thorne sat in the very corner of the compartment, his forehead pressed against the cool window pane. He was 11 years old, yet in this moment he felt much smaller, as if the world had suddenly expanded in size while he had shrunk to the dimensions of a pocket watch. He was wearing brand new school robes that still smelled of Madame Malkin's shop, a mixture of lavender, starch, and the faint, dusty scent of magical chalk. The robes were a fraction too long in the sleeves, and Jasper occasionally withdrew his hands inside them, like a tortoise retreating into its shell. He was not alone in the compartment, yet he felt profoundly solitary. Opposite him sat two boys who had already managed to become acquainted, and were now loudly debating the merits of the latest racing brooms. They tossed around names: Firebolt 7, Comet 360, words that to Jasper were merely a collection of sounds. He had never flown on a broomstick. To be honest, he even climbed the ladder in his father's garden with a certain degree of trepidation. Jasper shifted his gaze to his luggage, which rested on the rack above. There, inside an old leather trunk that his grandfather had once taken to school, lay his treasures. Not gold, nor artifacts, but books. The Theory of Defensive Charms, A History of Magic, 1,000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. He had read them all back home, in his room with the view of the apple orchard. There, at home, magic had seemed safe, cozy, like a warm blanket. It lived on the pages of books, smelled of ink, and promised wonders. But here, on a train hurtling through the night towards the north, magic was becoming real, loud, and unpredictable. The lights in the compartment flickered dimly as the train took another sharp turn. Shadows from the luggage nets danced upon the walls like whimsical creatures. Jasper adjusted his glasses on his nose, a habitual gesture that always soothed him a little. "Why are you so quiet?" one of the boys opposite asked suddenly. He had a round face and lively brown eyes. Jasper flinched. I'm just reading," he mumbled, though the book on his knees had been closed for half an hour. "First year?" The boy persisted. "Me too. I'm Oliver, and this is Ben. We reckon we'll be in Gryffindor. Where do you want to go?" Jasper felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Where did he want to go? He wanted to go home. He wanted to be sitting in the kitchen, drinking cocoa, and listening to the clicking of knitting needles, as his mother enchanted them to knit a scarf all by themselves. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Probably somewhere quiet." Oliver and Ben exchanged glances and snorted with laughter. It wasn't a malicious laugh, merely surprised, but Jasper felt awkward nonetheless. He sank even deeper into his robes. Outside the window, the landscape had changed. Towns and villages had long been left behind, giving way to the wild, gloomy hills of Scotland. Even through the darkness and the rain, Jasper could sense the majesty of these places. Mountains loomed in the distance, looking like the spines of sleeping dragons. The train began to slow down. First, the sound of the wheels changed. The rhythmic clatter became heavier, slower, as if the train were exhaling wearily after a long run. Then, the driver's voice, amplified by magic, rolled through the carriages. "We will be arriving at Hogsmeade in 5 minutes. Please leave your luggage on the train. It will be taken to the school separately." Jasper's heart beat so violently that he felt it might leap out of his chest and hide under the seat. The moment had arrived. The theory was over. The practice was beginning. When the train finally came to a halt, the corridor filled with noise. The banging of doors, the tramping of hundreds of feet, shouts, laughter, the mewing of cats, and the hooting of owls. It all merged into a single roar. Jasper waited until the stream of students thinned a little, and only then did he dare to step out of the compartment. He stepped onto the platform and immediately felt the frosty air nip at his cheeks. It was far colder here than in London. Steam rose from the students, mouths in white clouds, drifting up towards the dim lanterns that swung in the wind. First years over here. Don't wander off." The voice booming over the platform did not belong to the giant Jasper had read about in books concerning Harry Potter. He must have retired long ago, but to a tall, sturdy woman in a thick dragon-hide coat. She held a lantern high above her head, its light picking out her stern, weather-beaten face with a scar on her chin. This was Madame Roller, the new gamekeeper. She looked as though she could stop a hippogriff with a single glance. Move along," she urged, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "The weather won't wait." Jasper, trying not to slip on the wet wooden planks of the platform, hurried towards the group of small, frightened children huddled around the lantern. He noticed he was not the only one. Many of the first years looked as though they wished to be anywhere but here. "We will now proceed to the boats," announced Madame Roller. "Watch your step. The path is slippery and steep. And do not stray from the group. There are things in the forest you are not yet ready to meet." These words did not instill Jasper with confidence. He wrapped his robes tighter around himself and followed the others. The descent to the lake was like a journey into the heart of darkness. The forest around them murmured, trees creaked, and Jasper imagined branches trying to snatch at the hem of his clothes. He walked looking exclusively at his feet, at the wet stones and mud, afraid to raise his eyes. But suddenly the crowd ahead stopped and fell silent. A collective "ooh" rippled through the air. Jasper raised his head. They had emerged onto the shore of the Black Lake. The water was dark and smooth as obsidian, despite the wind, but it was not the lake that had captured the children's attention. On the opposite bank, atop a high cliff, stood the castle. It was immense, far larger than Jasper could have ever imagined. Hundreds of windows glowed with warm, golden light, piercing the night's darkness. Towers and spires reached for the clouds, and it seemed the castle had not been built by hands, but had grown from the mountain itself, a part of the land's own magic. It was terrifying, it was magnificent, it was beautiful. "Fall to a boat," Madame Roller commanded. Jasper found himself in a boat with Oliver, a boy with a very pale face, and a girl who was clutching a teddy bear tightly beneath her robes. "Don't panic," Jasper whispered to himself as the boat lurched and moved away from the shore of its own accord. They sailed in silence. The only sound was the lapping of water against the sides. Jasper watched the reflection of the castle in the water. It trembled and curved, like a living thing. He trailed his hand downwards, touching the surface. It was freezing, but for a moment he thought he felt warmth, a faint, barely perceptible pulse somewhere in the depths. Magic. The lake was saturated with it. The boats glided through a curtain of ivy that concealed an opening in the cliff face and found themselves in an underground harbor. It was quiet here, smelling of stone and eternity. The light of torches reflected off the damp walls, creating a play of shadows. When Jasper climbed out of the boat onto the pebbly shore, his legs were trembling. He was here. The way back was cut off by the dark lake. Ahead lay only the stairs leading up to the great oak doors. "Form a line," barked Madame Roller, checking that everyone had disembarked. "Up we go. Professor Longbottom is waiting for you." Longbottom, thought Jasper. He had read that name. A war hero, the herbology teacher. This gave him a sliver of courage. If a hero was named Neville, perhaps there was hope for a Jasper too. They ascended the stairs and stopped before the entrance. Madame Roller struck the door 3 times with her massive fist. The doors swung open. A wave of warm air, rich with the scents of food, beeswax and pine, hit their faces. After the cold outside, it was like stepping into an embrace. They were met by a tall man in robes the color of moss. He had a kind, open face, slightly comical ears, and eyes that radiated calm. Professor Longbottom. "Thank you, Roller," he nodded to the gamekeeper. "I will take them from here." He turned to the first years and smiled. It was not the polite smile of an adult, but the genuine, encouraging smile of someone who remembered what it was like to stand there, wet, frightened, and small. "Welcome to Hogwarts," he said softly. "I know you are nervous. That is normal. I was nervous too. I even lost my toad right here on these stairs, many years ago." Someone in the crowd giggled. The tension eased slightly. "In a moment you will enter the Great Hall," the professor continued. "The whole school is waiting for you there. But do not be afraid. You are not going to a trial. You are going home. You will be sorted into your houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, or Slytherin. Each has its own history, and each will become your family." Jasper listened, and the word family resonated within him with a strange warmth. He loved his parents, but they were muggles. Well, Dad was a muggle, and Mum was a witch who had given up magic for a quiet life. He had always felt a little different amongst ordinary children. Perhaps here he would finally find a place where his oddities were the norm. "Ready?" asked Professor Longbottom. No one answered, but everyone froze in anticipation. The professor nodded and pushed open the doors to the Great Hall. When the colossal doors to the Great Hall swung wide, Jasper involuntarily squeezed his eyes shut. After the darkness of the lake and the gloom of the entrance hall, the light here seemed almost a physical substance. Thick, golden honey pouring from everywhere. He cautiously opened one eye, then the other, and his breath hitched. He had read about this place in Hogwarts history, seen illustrations, but no book could convey the sense of space that opened up before him. Thousands of candles didn't just hang in the air. They drifted slowly, like shoals of fireflies, casting soft reflections on the 4 long tables where the students sat. Golden plates and goblets sparkled as if they had just been polished with sunbeams. But the most amazing thing was the ceiling. Or rather, the absence of one. Instead of stone vaults, a velvet abyss of night sky stretched overhead, strewn with myriads of stars. They were the very same stars as outside, but here, in the warmth of the castle, they did not seem cold or indifferent. They looked like diamond dust, scattered by a benevolent wizard to protect those below. "Keep up," Professor Longbottom reminded them gently, leading the line of first years down the aisle between the Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw tables. Jasper tried to walk steadily, but his feet got tangled in the hem of his too long robes. He felt the gaze of hundreds of eyes upon him. Some were curious, some indifferent, some assessing. He pulled his head into his shoulders, wishing he could become invisible. "Don't trip, just don't trip," he chanted to himself, staring at the back of the girl in front of him, whose hair ribbons were trembling. Ahead, on a raised platform where the staff table stood, a hat lay upon an ordinary wooden stool. It was old, battered, patched in places, and looked as though it belonged in an attic, not in the center of a grand hall. But Jasper knew, inside this piece of fabric lived a magic older than many of the wizards present. The hall fell silent. Even the candles seemed to stop crackling. The hat twitched. A rip near the brim opened like a mouth, and it began to sing. Its voice was scratchy but strangely melodic, like the sound of old parchment being rolled into a scroll. It sang of unity in times of change, that history is not just the past but a foundation for the future, and that in every heart there is room for courage, wisdom, loyalty, or ambition. When the song ended, applause erupted. Professor Longbottom unrolled a long scroll of parchment. "When I call your name," he announced, his voice magically amplified to reach the farthest corners of the hall easily, "you will sit on the stool, and I will place the sorting hat on your head." "Ackerman! Rose!" A small girl with curly hair ran out of the line, nearly losing a shoe. She sat down, and the hat, which was far too big for her, slipped right down over her nose. "Hufflepuff!" the hat shouted after a few seconds. The table on the right exploded with cheers. Rose, beaming with happiness, ran to her new friends. Jasper watched the process, and every new name brought him closer to the inevitable. Thorne was at the end of the alphabet. This meant long minutes of waiting, while his fear grew, and swelled inside him like dough with too much yeast. He examined the staff table. In the center, on a large throne-like chair, sat Headmistress McGonagall. Her hair was completely white, but her back remained as straight as it was in the old photographs in history books. She looked at the first years sternly, but a barely perceptible smile hid in the corners of her eyes. Greengrass Astoria, Slytherin, Jordan Leo, Gryffindor, Chung May, Ravenclaw. Names flashed by, children disappeared to their tables, and the line thinned. Oliver, the boy from the train, got into Gryffindor, just as he had dreamed. He gave a thumbs up as he ran past Jasper, but Jasper was too petrified to respond. He began running through the options in his head. Hufflepuff? They say the kitchen is next to the common room. That sounded cozy. Ravenclaw. You have to solve riddles to get in. That was terrifying. What if he forgot the answer and had to sleep outside the door? Slytherin? They value cunning there. Jasper wasn't cunning. He couldn't even lie to his mum about who ate the last biscuit. Thorne Jasper. The world stopped. Sounds vanished. Only the pounding of his own heart remained, echoing in his temples. Jasper felt a light push in the back. One of the children helped him move. He walked to the stool as if to the scaffold. He felt the gaze of hundreds of people. It seemed to him that everyone could see his knees shaking. Just don't fall. Just don't fall, he begged his legs. He sat. The stool was hard. Professor Longbottom smiled at him. Encouragingly, warmly, as if saying, "It will be all right, lad." That smile momentarily dispersed the fog of panic. Then the world disappeared. The hat dropped over his eyes. At first there was darkness. It smelled of old velvet, dust, and slightly of dried herbs. And then a voice spoke in his head. It was quiet, insinuating, as if someone were whispering thoughts directly into his brain. "Oh ho! What an interesting case. I haven't seen such chaos in such a small head for a long time." Jasper gripped the edges of the stool until his knuckles turned white. "Don't be afraid," the hat continued, a note of amusement entering its tone. "I don't bite. Although once a student tried to eat me. But that is another story. Let's see what we have here." Jasper felt a strange sensation, as if someone were flipping through the pages of a book inside his mind. Memories of his mother's garden. Of hours spent with a book under the duvet with a torch. Of how scared he was of thunderstorms. Of how he found an injured bird and nursed it for a week, hiding it from the cat. Kindness. Yes, a lot of kindness, the hat mused. You want to care for things. You want quiet. Hufflepuff, you would fit in wonderfully there. A warm fire, friends, safety. You like that, don't you? Yes, please, Jasper screamed in his thoughts. Safety. I want safety. Of course you do. Who doesn't? But wait. What is this here deeper down? Beneath the fear, beneath the desire to hide. Jasper tensed. What could be there? You read about heroes, Jasper. You admired them. Not because they were strong, but because they kept going when they were afraid. You despise yourself for your fear, but it is your capacity to feel it that makes you interesting. I am a coward, thought Jasper bitterly. A coward wouldn't have got on this train, the hat retorted firmly. You came here, even though every cell in your body screamed, no. You are sitting here now, ready to accept your fate. I see a spark, lad. It is tiny, buried under the ash of doubt, but it is there. And if I send you where there is only peace, it might go out. You need the wind to turn that spark into a flame. No, I don't want the wind, You want to grow. I see it. You want to become someone more than the boy who hides. You need a challenge. You need a family that won't let you retreat. The hat took a breath, or whatever it did, before shouting. Jasper squeezed his eyes shut even tighter. Gryffindor, the verdict rang out across the hall. When Professor Longbottom removed the hat, Jasper sat motionless. He was stunned. He heard applause. Loud, thunderous applause from the far table on the left. But it sounded like noise from another world. Gryffindor. Him? The place where Harry Potter studied? The place where they value bravery above all else. It was a catastrophic mistake. The hat was simply old. It must have confused him with someone else. Congratulations, Mr. Thorne, Neville Longbottom said warmly, giving him an encouraging nod. Excellent choice. Jasper slid off the stool and, unable to feel his legs, trudged towards the Gryffindor table. He sat in an empty seat at the edge, trying to take up as little space as possible. Hey, welcome to Gryffindor, an older boy with a prefect's badge shook his hand. I'm James. James Potter. Don't worry, we don't bite. Only on a full moon. A few students laughed. Jasper tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. He had fallen into the lion's den. And he was a mouse. But then, When the last child had been sorted, Headmistress McGonagall stood up. She did not speak for long. "Welcome," she said simply, "to a new year, to new knowledge, and to a delicious dinner." She clapped her hands, and the golden plates in front of Jasper instantly filled with food. It was like magic, which, strictly speaking, it was, but to a hungry 11-year-old boy it looked like the best miracle in the world. Mountains of roast potatoes, chops, sausages, Yorkshire puddings, vegetables, gravy. The aroma was so thick and delicious that Jasper felt his mouth water. He timidly took some potatoes and a piece of chicken. The first bite was divine, warm, filling, homely. He felt the warmth spread through his stomach, melting the block of ice that was his fear just a little. Life bustled around him. The Gryffindors were loud, cheerful, chaotic. Someone was demonstrating tricks with a fork. Someone was telling stories about summer holidays in Egypt. But, surprisingly, no one picked on Jasper. No one demanded heroic deeds from him. He was simply passed a jug of pumpkin juice and offered a slice of kidney pie. And sitting there, under the starry sky, surrounded by laughter and the warmth of 1,000 candles, Jasper Thorne thought that perhaps the hat had made a mistake, but it was a very delicious mistake. The dinner ended as abruptly as it had begun. The golden plates, which a moment ago had been scattered with crumbs of pumpkin tart and smears of chocolate mousse, became perfectly clean in a single second. Jasper felt the heaviness in his stomach turning into a pleasant, lulling drowsiness. Around him, students stretched and yawned, and even the noise in the hall became quieter, softer. Headmistress McGonagall rose from her throne. She needed no sonorous charm. Silence fell of its own accord the moment she raised her hand. "Now that we are all fed and watered," she said, "a few reminders. The forest on the school grounds is out of bounds to all students. Mr. Filch, our caretaker, has also asked me to remind you that magic in the corridors between classes is prohibited, and Quidditch tryouts will take place in the second week. Speak to Madam Hooch, and now, good night." The rumble of hundreds of benches being pushed back simultaneously filled the hall. "First years, hey, first years, over here." James Potter, the Gryffindor prefect, was waving his hand at them, standing by the exit. Jasper, barely moving his legs from exhaustion, joined the group of newcomers. Oliver, the boy from the train, looked as though he was about to fall asleep on his feet, leaning on the shoulder of his friend Ben. "Keep up. It's a bit of a trek, and the stairs like to play jokes," James warned cheerfully, leading them out of the hall. They emerged into the cool entrance hall, and from there began to climb the marble staircase. At first, walking was easy, but the higher they climbed, the heavier Jasper's legs became. The castle seemed to be an endless labyrinth. They passed portraits whose inhabitants were not sleeping, but examining the new students with curiosity. "Look, new ones," whispered a lady in a crinoline to her neighbor, a knight polishing his armor. "They're so small this year." And terrified, laughed the knight, rattling a metal gauntlet. The stairs in Hogwarts truly lived a life of their own. Jasper nearly yelped when the flight they were climbing suddenly shuddered and began to move slowly to the right, connecting with a completely different corridor. "Easy, it's normal," called James. "Just wait for them to stop." Jasper gripped the banister. It felt as though he were sailing on a ship during a storm. When the stairs finally halted with a dull thud, he exhaled. This place was full of wonders, But these wonders required strong nerves. They climbed higher and higher. Past tapestries depicting troll hunting, the trolls moved and waved their clubs comically, past suits of armor that creaked when someone walked by. Jasper lost count of the floors. 5th, 6th, 7th. Finally, when Jasper's breathing had become heavy and wheezing, they stopped at the end of a long corridor. Before them hung a huge painting in a golden frame. It depicted a woman in a pink silk dress, the fat lady. "Password?" she asked, primly adjusting her hairstyle. "Phoenix feather," James said clearly. "Correct," the lady nodded. The painting swung forward, revealing a round hole in the wall. "In you go," James commanded. "And welcome home." Jasper climbed in first, as he happened to be closest. He crawled through the short tunnel and straightened up, and froze. If the Great Hall was majestic and solemn, then the Gryffindor Common Room was alive. That was the only word for it. It breathed warmth. It was a round room, filled with soft, deep armchairs, upholstered in worn red velvet. They looked as though generations of students had sat in them, and each chair had already taken the shape of the person resting in it. Thick rugs lay underfoot, their patterns made only cozier by time. But the heart of the room was the fireplace. It was enormous, built of rough, dark stone, and a real fire blazed within it. Not magical, cold fire, but living, hot fire that devoured thick logs. It crackled, shot sparks, and filled the room with the scent of smoke, wood, and safety. Outside the windows, hidden by heavy red drapes, the wind howled. Jasper could hear the rain beating against the glass, the elements raging around the high tower. But here, inside, that sound only emphasized the coziness. It was the feeling of sitting in a warm burrow, while the world outside could not reach you. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting lions, knights, and wizards of the past. Everywhere there were tables scattered with old magazines, quills, and sweet wrappers. "Boys. Up the stairs to the left, girls, to the right," James explained. "Your things are already there." Jasper, barely moving his legs from exhaustion and the warmth that immediately made him drowsy, trudged towards the spiral staircase. The first year's room was at the very top of the tower. It was round, with 5 four-poster beds. The dark red velvet curtains were drawn back, revealing snow-white sheets and plump duvets. Beside each bed stood a trunk. Jasper immediately recognized his own, old, battered, with brass corners. Someone, probably the very elves he had read about, had already placed it at the foot of the bed. On the bedside table lay his pajamas, carefully folded, and a glass of water. In the middle of the room stood a pot-bellied stove, radiating pleasant warmth, but the main source of light and comfort were the beds. They looked like little fortresses. "I bagged this one," shouted Oliver, collapsing onto the bed near the door. Jasper walked to the bed by the window. He liked windows, even if it was dark outside. He ran his hand over the velvet of the canopy. The fabric was soft, heavy, and smelled of lavender. He changed slowly. The other boys, Oliver, Ben, a boy named Simon, and another called Daniel, were already chatting, laughing, and throwing socks at each other. They seemed so light, so simple. Jasper felt a little apart, but not like on the train. Here he was part of the group. He was a Gryffindor, even if he didn't quite believe it himself yet. "You all right, Jasper?" asked Ben, pulling on pajamas patterned with snitches. "Fine," Jasper answered, and to his surprise, realized it was true. Just tired. He climbed into bed. The mattress was soft but didn't sag, supporting his back perfectly. The duvet was heavy, and that was pleasant. It seemed to press him into safety, keeping his anxieties from rising. Jasper drew the curtains around his bed. The world narrowed to this red, warm cocoon. Beyond the thick stone walls of the castle, the Scottish autumn raged. The wind howled like a wounded beast, trying to find a crack in the masonry. Rain lashed against the tower roof. But these sounds were distant, muffled. Here inside, silence reigned, broken only by the steady breathing of his neighbors and the quiet creak of an old bed frame as someone turned over in their sleep. Jasper lay staring into the darkness beneath the dome of the canopy. The hat's words still echoed in his head. A spark. You need the wind to turn that spark into a flame. He didn't feel like a flame. He felt like a small ember that just wanted not to be extinguished. But here, in this tower, amongst these walls that had seen thousands of boys just like him over the centuries, he felt for the first time that perhaps his fear was not the end. Perhaps it was just the beginning of something else. He closed his eyes. Images of the day floated before him. The train, the lake, the candles, the hat, the food, the fire in the grate. All of it blended into a warm, golden swirl. Jasper Thorne fell asleep. And on this first night at Hogwarts, he dreamt of nothing. There was only darkness, but not the frightening cold darkness of the train, but the soft velvet darkness of sleep that embraced and protected. The first week at Hogwarts melted away as quickly as a lump of sugar in hot tea, leaving behind only the sweet aftertaste of novelty and a slight dizziness. For Jasper Thorne, these 7 days had merged into one long, continuous stream of impressions. He remembered them in flashes, wandering in search of the history of magic classroom and accidentally stumbling upon a tapestry where knights were attempting to teach trolls ballet, tasting pumpkin juice for the first time and marveling at its spicy autumnal flavor. Sitting in the Gryffindor Common Room, listening to older students argue about the cannons, chances in this Quidditch season. He had survived. He hadn't got lost for long. He hadn't been expelled, and he had even found common ground with his dorm mates. Oliver, who turned out to be a tireless chatterbox, and Ben, who, like Jasper, loved collecting chocolate frog cards. But real magic, the kind that required a wand and incantations, still remained something distant and frightening to him. And then came the second week. Monday morning began not with an alarm clock, but with the sound of rain. It was not the light, drizzling rain Jasper loved back home in Kent. This was a true Scottish storm, heavy, persistent, and merciless. Raindrops drummed against the window panes of the high Gryffindor tower with such force that they seemed to be trying to break inside, to find shelter from the cold wind that howled around the castle like a hungry dragon. Jasper lay in his 4-poster bed, wrapped in his duvet up to his ears. A grey gloom reigned in the room. The red velvet of the canopy, which had seemed warm and cozy in the evening, now looked dark, almost maroon. The air in the dormitory had cooled overnight, and Jasper could see his breath turning into small clouds of steam. He didn't want to get up. Here, under the duvet, it was safe. Out there, cold stone, long corridors, and most terrifying of all, his first transfiguration lesson awaited him. Oliver, in the next bed, yawned loudly and rustled his covers. "Merlin's beard," he muttered in a sleepy voice. "Tell me it's Sunday, please someone." "It's Monday," Ben replied ruthlessly from his corner. "And we have Transfiguration first, with McGonagall." Jasper felt the familiar cold knot tighten in his stomach. McGonagall, the headmistress. The woman who, rumor had it, could turn a disobedient student into a map of the grounds and hang them on the wall in Filch's office. Of course, these were only rumors, but Jasper had seen her gaze during the sorting. That gaze saw everything. He finally forced himself to climb out from under the warm duvet. The cold instantly seized his bare feet, making him curl his toes. He began to dress quickly, shivering. His shirt was cool to the touch, but his woolen jumper and thick school robes warmed him a little. Tying his tie with its red and gold stripes, he looked in the mirror. Staring back was the same small boy with tousled hair, who didn't look like a brave Gryffindor at all. "Ready?" asked Oliver, who had managed to put his robes on inside out, and was now trying to rectify the situation without taking them off completely. "I think so," Jasper replied quietly, checking his bag. A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration by Emmerich Switch lay on top. It was heavy and smelled of printer's ink. Jasper had read the first chapter 3 times, but he still felt as though he knew nothing. They descended the spiral staircase into the common room. The fire was already blazing, spreading the pleasant scent of burning oak. A few older students sat in armchairs finishing essays, but most students were still asleep or just waking up. The journey to the Great Hall was a trial. Drafts roamed the corridors, billowing robes like sails. Jasper wrapped his clothes tighter around himself, trying to preserve the remnants of warmth. They passed the portrait of Sir Cadogan, who was trying to saddle his pony, which stubbornly refused to leave its painted stable into the rain. Even painted animals at Hogwarts had common sense. It was warmer in the Great Hall. Thousands of candles floating beneath the enchanted ceiling created the illusion of a sunny morning, although the ceiling itself reflected a leaden-grey sky across which heavy clouds were racing. Breakfast was, as always, magnificent, but Jasper could barely eat. The porridge seemed like a lump of clay to him, and the toast like cardboard. He chewed mechanically, staring at his plate. "You have to eat." Ben nudged him with an elbow. "Transfiguration requires a lot of energy. My brother said if you do magic on an empty stomach, you can faint." Jasper looked at him in alarm. Fainting in McGonagall's class? That would be the end. He forced himself to swallow a few spoonfuls of porridge and drink a glass of pumpkin juice. "I heard we'll be turning matches," whispered a boy named Simon, leaning across the table. "It's the hardest thing we've done. You have to change the very essence of the object." "Matches?" Jasper asked again. His voice trembled treacherously. "Into needles." "Exactly. Into silver, sharp needles." Simon nodded with the air of an expert. "And if you do something wrong, the match might catch fire, or turn into a splinter, or—" "Stop scaring him, Simon," intervened a girl with red hair sitting nearby. This was Lily, namesake of Harry Potter's legendary mother, and she seemed afraid of nothing. "It will be fine. It's only the first lesson." Jasper was grateful for her support, but his fear didn't vanish. It grew, filling all the space inside, displacing breakfast and common sense. When the bell rang, signaling the start of classes, Jasper stood up, feeling his legs turn to jelly. They headed towards the Transfiguration classroom on the ground floor. The corridor outside the classroom was crowded with students. There were both Gryffindors and Ravenclaws. This lesson was shared. Jasper noticed that even the usually calm Ravenclaw students looked a little tense. They were leafing through textbooks, repeating formulas, and this made Jasper even more nervous. If even the clever ones were worried, what was he to do? The classroom doors opened by themselves, inviting them inside. The Transfiguration classroom was spacious and high-ceilinged, resembling a cathedral of science. Along the walls stood cabinets with glass doors, behind which strange objects could be seen. Cups with rabbit ears, teapots running on little legs, and stacks of old leather-bound books. The room smelled of chalk, old parchment, and a peculiar dry cleanliness. On the teacher's desk, perfectly still, sat a tabby cat. Its eyes, framed by distinctive markings, watched every student who crossed the threshold intently. Jasper knew who it was. He had read about animagi, but knowing and seeing were two different things. He walked past the desk, trying not to look the cat in the eye, and sat at a desk in the second row by the window. The rain against the glass had intensified, turning into a solid wall of water that cut them off from the rest of the world. When everyone was seated and silence fell, the cat gracefully leaped off the desk. While still in mid-air, its body began to change, to blur, and a moment later, not an animal but a tall woman in emerald robes landed on the floor. Professor McGonagall adjusted her glasses and swept the class with a stern look. "Transfiguration," she began, and her voice was quiet, yet every sound reached the farthest corner of the room, "is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts." She paused, letting the words settle in the children's minds. "Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned." Jasper pressed himself into his chair. He was afraid to even breathe loudly. The professor took out her wand and, with an effortless movement, turned her desk into a huge glossy pig, and then back again. The class gasped. It was incredible. It was impossible. It was beautiful. "But you are a long way from that," she said, returning the desk to its usual appearance. "Today we will start with the basics, with the simplest transformation of inanimate matter." She walked between the rows, handing each student a single object. When she approached Jasper, he held out a trembling hand. She placed an ordinary match on it. It was small, wooden, with a red sulfur head. A simple, mundane object. An object that could be snapped with 2 fingers. "Your task," said McGonagall, returning to the blackboard, "is to turn this match into a needle." She wrote the wand movement formula on the board. A sharp, short jab and a small, neat swirl at the end. Then she wrote the incantation. "Akasphors." Jasper stared at the word. It looked sharp, like the object it was meant to create. "Attention," said the professor. "Success does not depend on how loudly you shout the spell, nor even on the power of your magic. Success depends on your concentration. You must see the needle. You must know what it feels like, how it shines, how cold it is. You must change the very idea of wood into the idea of metal." She demonstrated the movement once more. You may begin." The classroom filled with sounds. Arcos Fours rang out from all sides. Someone was waving their wand like a windmill. Someone was poking the match with it as if trying to skewer it. Jasper placed the match before him on the worn wooden desktop. He took out his wand. Cherry, 11 inches, dragon heartstring. It was warm and slightly rough, familiar. He looked at the match. Wood. Fibers. Warm, soft, living. Needle. Metal. Cold, smooth, hard, lifeless. How could one turn one into the other? It seemed a betrayal of the match's nature. "Come on, Jasper," he told himself mentally. "You're a Gryffindor. Bravery. You just have to try." He raised his wand. His hand was trembling. He tried to imagine the needle as the professor had said. Silver. Shiny. But his mind was swirling with the thought that everyone was about to see he couldn't do anything. "Akasphas," he whispered and made the movement. The match didn't even budge. It lay there, mocking him with its wooden essence. Jasper looked around. Oliver next to him was jabbing at his match so hard it bounced away. "Become a needle, you stupid wood," he hissed. Ben's match had turned slightly grey, as if covered in dust, but remained wood. "Maybe I'm not the only one," thought Jasper with hope. But then, 2 rows away, a girl from Ravenclaw raised her hand. Her match was gleaming. It had turned silver, although it still had the shape of a match. "Not a bad start, Miss Chang," McGonagall nodded. 5 points to Ravenclaw. Jasper sighed. The abyss between him and magic seemed vast. He looked at his match again. He remembered how at home, when he was scared, he would imagine building a wall, brick by brick. It helped him focus. Maybe he needed to do the same here? Not think about the result, but think about the process. He closed his eyes. He shut out the noise of the class, the rain outside the window, his own fear. He imagined his match not as a whole object, but as a collection of tiny particles. Wooden particles. Compress, he thought. Become denser. Become cold. Forget the warmth of the sun that grew this tree. Remember the cold of the earth from which metal was mined. He felt a strange tingling in the fingers holding the wand. It was like when your arm goes to sleep and the blood starts to return, but more pleasant. Warmth flowed from his shoulder, through his elbow to his wrist. He opened his eyes. The match lay on the table. Jasper pointed his wand at it. The movement. A sharp, short jab. Akasphas. This time he didn't ask, he stated. The air around the tip of his wand vibrated ever so slightly. The match shuddered. Jasper leaned closer, holding his breath. It wasn't perfect. It was far from perfect. The match was still a match. Thick, wooden, but its head, the red sulfur, had vanished. Instead, there was a sharp, silvery point. He touched it cautiously with a finger. Cold, smooth, metal. Jasper couldn't suppress a smile. It was small, timid, but real. He had done it. He had changed the world. Just a tiny bit, by a millimeter, but he had changed it. A shadow fell across his desk. He raised his head. Professor McGonagall was standing beside him. She looked at his half-match through her square spectacles. Jasper froze, expecting criticism. "You have changed the point," she stated. Her voice was impassive, but Jasper thought he heard a note of approval. "Not bad for a first attempt, Mr. Thorne. You have grasped the main thing, the essence of changing material. Most try to change the form, forgetting the substance." She moved on, leaving Jasper alone with his small triumph. He looked at the silver tip again. It was just a needle. Not even a needle, but a hint of one. But for Jasper in that moment, it was Excalibur. It was proof. He was a wizard. And he could do this. When the doors of the Transfiguration classroom closed behind Jasper, he felt as though a heavy weight had fallen from his shoulders. The corridor was filled with noise, students discussing the lesson, laughing, complaining about the difficulty of the homework, a 12-inch essay on the properties of silver. But Jasper didn't feel the burden. In his pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief, lay that very match with the silver tip. A small, inconspicuous proof that he wasn't hopeless. "Did you see?" Oliver was bouncing alongside, nearly knocking over passers-by with his bag. "Mine smoked. McGonagall said I was too combustible. Do you think that's a compliment?" "I think she meant you nearly set fire to the desk," Ben remarked sensibly, adjusting his glasses. "But Jasper, you did it." "Real metal." Jasper blushed, but this time with pleasure, not shame. "Only the tip," he mumbled. "That's more than half the class managed." Oliver clapped him on the shoulder. "Let's go eat. I'm so hungry I could eat a hippogriff, hooves and all." Lunch in the Great Hall that day seemed to Jasper the most delicious of his life. He didn't even notice the storm intensifying outside the windows, turning day into twilight. Inside, warmth prevailed. He heaped a full plate of shepherd's pie, hot, with a golden crust of mashed potato hiding a juicy filling. He drank pumpkin juice, cold, sweet, with a taste of cinnamon and autumn. This taste reminded him of home, of Halloween, of something safe and familiar. Sitting at the Gryffindor table, listening to older students discuss the merits of different types of dragon hide for gloves, Jasper for the first time did not feel like an imposter. He was just eating his pie. He was just listening. He was here. The rest of the week passed in a strange mixture of the mundane and the miraculous. It turned out that magic wasn't just wand-waving. It was also an awful lot, of ink. On Wednesday evening, Jasper sat in the Gryffindor Common Room, trying to cope with an essay for Professor Binns. The common room was filled with a cozy hum. In the fireplace, as always, flames roared, casting dancing shadows around the room. At one of the tables, third-year twins were trying to enchant chess pieces to sing when taken. So far the pawns only squeaked pitifully. Jasper struggled with his quill. At home he was used to ballpoint pens, simple, convenient, reliable. A quill was a temperamental instrument. It would scratch the parchment, leave greasy blotches, or suddenly refuse to write at all. "Another blot," he sighed, watching a black puddle spread over the word goblin, turning it into G-bl-N. "You need blotting paper," advised an older boy sitting in a nearby armchair reading the Daily Prophet. "And hold the quill lighter. You're not trying to strangle a goose, you're just writing." Jasper tried to relax his hand. He carefully dipped the tip of the quill into the inkwell, shook off the excess drop, and continued. Scratch, scratch. Scratch, scratch. This sound, the scratching of dozens of quills on parchment in a warm room, was hypnotic. It was the sound of learning. The sound of Hogwarts. When the essay was finished, with 3 blots but entirely legible, Oliver pulled a deck of cards from his pocket. "Exploding snap," he announced. "Who's playing?" Jasper wanted to refuse. He had never played, he didn't like explosions. But Ben was already pulling up a chair, and Simon had put down his book. "Come on, Jasper," said Ben. "It's just about being quick." And Jasper agreed. The next hour passed, in smoke and laughter. The cards really did explode. Not violently, like large crackers, if you didn't manage to discard them in time. Jasper turned out to be a surprisingly good player. His habit of observing and being quiet helped him notice when the cards started to smoke before the others. When Oliver dawdled, and the deck in his hands went bang, showering him in soot so that he looked like a raccoon, Jasper laughed. It wasn't a polite titter, but real, loud laughter that made his ribs ache. He laughed along with everyone else, sitting on the worn rug by the fire, and felt invisible threads tying him to these people, to this room, to this evening. The week was drawing to a close. Friday evening brought with it exhaustion, but it was a pleasant exhaustion, like after a long walk in the woods. When Jasper climbed the spiral staircase to the dormitory, it was dark and cool. The stove in the center of the room glowed, casting red reflections on the brass legs of the beds. The boys were already asleep. Oliver was snoring, face buried in his pillow. Ben was muttering something in his sleep. Jasper walked to the window. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a thick fog that enveloped the castle like white cotton wool. Somewhere down there was the lake, the forbidden forest, the gamekeeper's hut. But here, at the top of the tower, Jasper felt as if he were floating on a cloud. He changed into his pajamas and climbed into bed. The sheets were warmed. The elves must have put hot water bottles in before bed, he thought gratefully. He drew the curtains, shutting himself off from the room with a velvet wall. Lying in the dark, he listened to the sounds of the tower, the whistle of the wind, which never ceased at such a height, the crackling of coals in the stove, the breathing of his friends. He remembered the hat's words about the spark. Perhaps bravery isn't always roaring like a lion, Jasper thought, closing his eyes. Maybe sometimes bravery is simply trying again when you've made a blot on your parchment, or sitting down to play a game you're afraid of, or just allowing yourself to fall asleep in an unfamiliar place, knowing that tomorrow will be a new day. Sleep came unnoticed. He dreamt of a silver match that turned into a small rapier, and he, Jasper, was fencing with it against an ink blot that was trying to swallow his homework. And in his dream, he was winning. The second week ended. Jasper Thorne was still a quiet boy who loved books more than adventures. But now he knew. Even in stone, warmth can be found if you know how to touch it. And even the smallest needle can be the beginning of great magic. The third week burst into Hogwarts not with a polite knock at the door, but with the loud, unceremonious howling of the wind, while in the Slytherin dungeons or the kitchens near Hufflepuff, the change in weather was felt only as a slight draft across the floor. In Gryffindor Tower, which thrust into the sky like a defiantly raised finger, the wind was the undisputed master. It woke earlier than the students. Jasper Thorne opened his eyes because the window frame beside his bed was rattling, as if someone invisible were persistently trying to get inside. The sun, cold and blindingly bright, was already flooding the round dormitory. Unlike the rainy gloom of the previous week, this morning was transparent to the point of ringing. The air in the room smelled of ozone and fresh laundry. Jasper buried his nose deeper into his pillow. He didn't want to get out. Today was Thursday. A day that was circled in red ink in his imaginary calendar of catastrophes. Today was the first flying lesson. "Get up, sleepyhead." A pillow from the next bed flew straight at his head. Oliver was already on his feet. His hair was sticking out in all directions, even more than usual, and his eyes burned with a feverish glint. He was trying to pull on a sock and chew a licorice wand at the same time. "Have you seen the weather? The wind is perfect." "Well, a bit strong, but that just adds to the thrill. Imagine how we'll dive." "I am imagining," Jasper responded hollowly from under the duvet. "Diving, head first, into a pumpkin patch." He finally forced himself to sit up. The floor was cold, despite the thick rugs. The wind outside the window whistled so loudly that it seemed the tower was a gigantic flute. The morning routine turned into chaos. Since no one had wanted to leave their warm beds until the very last moment, 5 boys were now running around the cramped room, bumping into each other and searching for their things. "Where is my tie?" wailed Ben, looking under his bed. "I definitely put it on the bedside table." "Who took my defense textbook?" shouted Simon. "That's not yours, that's mine. Look, there's a cocoa stain on the page about ghouls." Jasper searched silently for his left sock. It was an eternal problem. Magic or not, socks at Hogwarts disappeared just as mysteriously as they did at home in Kent. He rummaged through his trunk, looked under the mattress, and even cautiously checked Oliver's boots. Nothing. Looking for a pair. Suddenly spoke the mirror hanging on the wardrobe door. It was old, with cloudy glass and a grumpy disposition. "Check the curtain rail, lad, and by the way, comb your hair. With a nest like that on your head, even the owls will be frightened." Jasper looked up. Indeed, a grey woolen sock was dangling from the canopy rail, like a flag of surrender. How it had got there remained a mystery Jasper decided not to solve. He jumped up, pulled it down, and began to dress. His robes no longer seemed foreign. Over these 3 weeks, they had stretched a little, absorbed the smell of smoke from the common room and the sweet scent of ink nuts. They had become his second skin. Jasper had learned to tie his tie with his eyes closed, although the knot still turned out a little crooked, and knew that it was better to keep his wand in the inside pocket, because it constantly fell out of the back pocket of his jeans when he sat down. Breakfast in the great hall was noisy. It seemed the wind had stirred up not only nature but the students as well. Everyone spoke louder, laughed more ringingly. The enchanted ceiling today was restless. Tattered scraps of clouds raced across it, revealing a pale blue abyss. Jasper picked at his eggs and bacon with a fork. He couldn't swallow. His stomach had tightened into a tight knot that not even the most talented wizard could untie. "You have to eat," said Lily sternly, sitting opposite. She was buttering a slice of toast with the precision of a surgeon. "You'll need strength to hold on to the broom. Or so you don't get blown away," added James Potter, walking past and ruffling Jasper's hair. "Don't worry, kid. The main thing is, don't look down. Actually, no, do look, it's beautiful. Just don't let go of the handle." The advice was dubious. Jasper pushed his plate away and took a sip of tea. His hands were shaking slightly, and the china cup clinked against the saucer. There were still 2 hours until the flying lesson. There was a free period in the timetable, which most Gryffindors planned to spend outside, kicking a ball around. But Jasper needed something else. He needed silence. He slipped out of the hall and headed for the library. Here, amongst thousands of books, the wind had no power. The walls were thick, the windows high and narrow, The air smelled of old paper, glue, and peace. Madame Pince, the librarian, patrolled the aisles as always, armed with a feather duster, which she wielded like a fearsome weapon against anyone who dared to whisper. Jasper found a free table in the farthest corner, in the History of Magical Artifacts section. He didn't intend to read. He just wanted to sit somewhere where the ground beneath his feet wasn't swaying. But his solitude was interrupted by a quiet sound. Someone was sniffling and jumping. Jasper peeked out from behind the stack. By a tall bookcase stood a small girl from Hufflepuff. Rose Ackerman, the very same one who had been sorted first. Her curly hair was tied back with a yellow ribbon, which had now slipped to one side. She was trying to reach a huge tome titled Encyclopedia of Fungal Pests, which stood on a shelf a good foot above her reach. She jumped, stretching her hand, but her fingertips only grazed the spine of the book. "Need some help?" Jasper asked quietly, emerging from his hiding place. Rose started and turned around. Her cheeks were red with effort. "Oh, hello. Yes, please. I need this book for Professor Longbottom's essay, and it must think I'm too small for it." Jasper stepped closer. He wasn't much taller than Rose, but taller nonetheless. He stood on tiptoe, stretched out his arm, and didn't reach it either. The book stood mockingly high. He looked at Rose. She looked upset. "Wait," he said. He looked around. Madame Pince was at the other end of the hall. There was no ladder nearby. Jasper remembered last week. Charms class. Professor Flitwick, the feather. "Maybe we try magic," he suggested uncertainly. Rose's eyes went round. "But we're forbidden to do magic in the corridors." "This is the library," Jasper remarked, taking out his wand. It was warm and slightly rough. "And it's for studying." He pointed his wand at the book. His heart hammered. What if he knocked the whole shelf over? "Lightness," he reminded himself of Flitwick's words. "Relax the wrist." "Wingardium Leviosa," he whispered. Nothing happened. "You need to be clearer," whispered Rose. And the movement, swish and flick. Jasper exhaled. He imagined the book becoming light, like a balloon. Wingardium Leviosa. The thick encyclopedia wobbled, lifted off the shelf, and slowly, swaying slightly, floated through the air. Seacher, Jasper, holding his breath, carefully guided his wand downwards. The book obediently lowered straight into Rose's open arms. She barely held its weight. "Wow!" she breathed. "You did it. Thanks, Jasper." She smiled at him, genuinely, sunnily, and her smile was brighter than the sun outside the window. "You're welcome." Jasper hid his wand, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. He had been able to do it. He had helped, and nothing had exploded. Maybe this day wasn't so bad after all. But time marched on relentlessly. The clock on the tower struck 2. The time for flying had arrived. Jasper walked out of the castle with a crowd of Gryffindors. They headed towards the training ground, a flat area of short-cropped grass located not far from the Forbidden Forest. As soon as they stepped out from the protection of the walls, the wind pounced on them. It tugged at the hems of their robes, threw dry leaves in their faces, and tried to tear off their ties. Slytherins were walking nearby. The lesson was shared. Jasper noticed Iris Bellamy, A girl with a piercing gaze, walking with her friends. She looked focused, but calm, not like him. Madam Hooch was already waiting for them on the pitch. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with short grey hair and yellow eyes, like a hawk's. She stood with her legs wide apart, and the wind seemed to flow around her, not daring to disturb her. 20 broomsticks lay on the grass. They looked old and tired. Some had bent twigs in the tail, others were worn to a shine on the handles. "Well, what are you waiting for?" barked Madam Hooch. Her voice cut through the noise of the wind. "Stand by a broom, everyone by their own, quickly." Jasper approached a broom lying at the edge. It was an old comet, which, judging by its appearance, had seen the days when Dumbledore was a student. It lay crookedly in the grass, as if indifferent to everything in the world. "Stick your right hand over the broom," commanded Madam Hooch, "and say, 'Up! Up!'" roared the class in unison. Oliver's broom instantly jumped into his hand, slapping his palm with a ringing sound. He beamed. Zabini's broom obeyed immediately too. Jasper looked at his broom. It lay motionless. "Up," he said uncertainly. The broom didn't even move. "Up!" he tried louder. The handle twisted slightly in the grass, as if getting comfortable, and froze again. Jasper felt the familiar cold knot of fear tightening in his stomach. Everyone was already standing with their brooms. He was one of the few still talking to the grass. "It senses your fear, Thorne," Madam Hooch threw out as she walked past. "You're asking it like it's charity. You have to command. You are in charge here, not a piece of wood." Jasper grit his teeth. "I am in charge." He looked at the broom. It was just wood. Birch and ash twigs. He had already changed wood into metal. He could force it to rise. He remembered the feeling when the book in the library had lifted off the shelf. The feeling of control. "Up!" he shouted, putting all his irritation at the wind, the socks, and his fear into that word. The broom shuddered and jumped up sharply. Jasper barely managed to catch it. The handle was hard, warm, and vibrated slightly in his palm, as if a cat were purring inside it. It was a strange sensation, holding something that had a will of its own. He exhaled. The first step was done, but the scariest part lay ahead. "Now," continued Madam Hooch, "once you've all got hold of your brooms, I want you to mount them. Grip it tight with your legs. When I blow my whistle, you kick off from the ground, hard. Keep your brooms steady, rise a few feet, and then come straight back down by leaning forward slightly. Only a few feet. No heroism." She raised the whistle to her lips. The wind blew harder, ruffling Jasper's hair. He swung a leg over the broom. It was uncomfortable and hard. The ground beneath his feet seemed so reliable, so safe. Leaving it meant trusting the wind. The whistle blew sharp as a gunshot. Jasper closed his eyes and kicked off. At first, there was a sensation of falling. Jasper's stomach leaped somewhere into his throat, as happens when a lift starts too quickly, or a swing in the park goes higher than you expected. The ground, solid and reliable, vanished from beneath his soles. Jasper squeezed his eyes shut even tighter, expecting the inevitable crash. He gripped the broom handle until his knuckles turned white and froze, turning into a tense string. He waited for the impact, waited for the pain, waited for the laughter. But there was no impact. There was only the wind. It whistled in his ears, tugged at his robes, chilled his cheeks. And there was something else. A strange, unfamiliar sensation of swaying. As if he was sitting not on a wooden stick, but on the branch of a mighty tree during a storm, or in a boat in the middle of the sea. "Open your eyes, Thorne," Madam Hooch's voice came from below. "You're not planning to sleep through the lesson in mid-air, are you?" Jasper forced himself to unclench his eyelids. First one, then the other. He was hanging in the air. Not high, perhaps 5 or 6 feet above the ground. But for a boy who had always preferred the solid floor of the library, it looked like the summit of Everest. The grass below seemed distant and unnaturally green. The tops of Oliver's boots, who was hovering to his left, were at Jasper's eye level. "I'm flying," he whispered, and the wind instantly snatched the words, carrying them away. "I'm really flying." His broom, the old comet, was behaving surprisingly well. It vibrated beneath him, emitting a low hum, like the purring of a large cat. It listed slightly to the left, as if nursing an old injury, but it held him. "Don't hang there like sacks of potatoes," Madam Hooch called, walking beneath them. "Straighten your backs, control the handle, lean forward slightly to stabilize." Jasper tried to follow the instruction. He carefully, millimeter by millimeter, leaned his torso forward. The broom responded responsively, shifting slightly. It was scary, but at the same time, logical. This wasn't a chaotic fall, it was an interaction. He looked sideways. Oliver naturally wasn't just hovering. He was trying to spin on the spot, grinning broadly. "This is wicked," he shouted to Jasper. "Look, I can do no hands." "Don't you dare let go, Wood," barked Madam Hooch without looking up. She definitely had eyes in the back of her head. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind struck from the direction of the forbidden forest. It wasn't just a breeze, but a true Scottish squall. A few students yelped. Iris, the Slytherin girl, deftly tilted her broom, cutting through the airflow. Oliver wobbled but held on, laughing. Jasper, however, was caught unawares. His broom spun sharply, and he felt himself losing balance. His right foot slipped. The world tipped. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. "I'm falling." But in that moment, Madam Hooch's words surfaced in his mind. "You are in charge here." And another strange thing from McGonagall's lesson. Compress. Become denser. Jasper didn't grab at the air. He did what he always did when he was scared. He froze. But this time he directed that tension into his hands. He gripped the handle with all his might and jerked it sharply up and to the right, against the wind. Not because he knew aerodynamics, but because he did not want to fall. The broom, creaking, obeyed. It straightened out, fighting the wind with him. Jasper returned his foot to the stirrup and exhaled. He was still hanging in the air. He hadn't fallen. "Not a bad reflex, Thorne," Madam Hooch commented dryly. "And now, everyone down. Lean forward. Smoothly." Jasper guided the broom towards the earth. The grass approached. When his boots touched the soil, he felt a jolt that reverberated in his knees. But it was the most pleasant jolt of his life. He dismounted. His legs were shaking like jelly, but he was standing. He looked at his hands. They were still clenched in the shape of the handle. "Did you see?" Oliver ran up, his hair now resembling a nest after a hurricane. I nearly got blown into the lake. And you straightened out so coolly. I thought you were going into the bushes. I thought so too, Jasper admitted honestly, and the corners of his lips twitched in a smile. But the broom, it was like it understood. They walked back to the castle, dragging the brooms to the shed. The wind still lashed their backs, but now it didn't seem like an enemy to Jasper, it was just an element. Just like him. The evening of that Thursday became a moment of absolute crystal clear comfort for Jasper. After the piercing wind on the flying pitch, the Gryffindor Common Room seemed not just a room, but a huge oven full of blankets and warmth. Jasper sat in a deep armchair right by the fire. His cheeks were still burning from the wind, and his body felt a pleasant ache, the kind that comes after hard physical work. In his hands he held a large ceramic mug of hot chocolate. It wasn't just cocoa, it was a thick, viscous drink prepared by the house elves in the kitchens, with a pinch of chili pepper and a mountain of tiny marshmallows that melted into sweet foam. Life bustled around him. The first years, excited after flying, couldn't calm down. And then I gunned it, Simon was telling, waving his arms and nearly knocking over an inkwell. And Madame Hooch was like, "Mr. Finnegan, this is not a race." "You flew 1/2 a meter, Simon," laughed Lily, who was sitting on the rug surrounded by potions textbooks. "And caught your foot on a daisy." "It was a tactical maneuver," Simon insisted. Jasper was silent, but he listened to them with pleasure. He warmed his fingers on the hot mug and watched the fire. He didn't need to tell any stories. He didn't need to boast. Inside him, somewhere beneath his ribs, lived a small, warm feeling of victory. He had left the ground, he had met the wind, and he had returned. He took a sip of chocolate. The sweet warmth spread down his throat, finally driving out the remnants of fear. Suddenly the portrait hole opened, and the Willoughby twins, who were always causing a ruckus, tumbled into the common room. "Attention!" shouted one of them. "Who wants fresh eclairs from the kitchen? We know the password to the painting with the pear." The common room exploded with joyous cheers. Jasper smiled. Here, amidst red velvet and laughter, the world seemed safe. And even the wind howling outside the window, trying to break through the thick glass, now seemed not a threat, but simply a song the castle was singing, lullabying its children. The next day, on Friday, Jasper decided to do what he had been putting off all week. He had to write to his mum. Not a big report, like on weekends, but just a message. He went up to the owlery during the lunch break. It was a place most students didn't like to visit without need. The owlery was at the top of the west tower, and the wind roamed freely here, for there were no windows, only arches. It smelled of straw, mice, and, to be honest, bird droppings. But there was also something majestic here. Hundreds of owls sat on perches, hiding their heads under their wings. Jasper found a school barn owl. It looked friendly, and didn't seem to be asleep, just contemplating the meaning of life. He took out a small scrap of parchment and a pencil. A quill would be inconvenient here. He pressed the parchment against the cold stone wall and wrote just a few lines. "Hi, Mum and Dad. It's very windy here. Today I flew. Well, that is, I hung in the air. It's scary, but I didn't fall. And I helped a girl in the library reach a book with magic. I did it. We had eclairs for lunch. Love, Jasper." He tied the note to the barn owl's leg. The bird hooted, gently nipped his finger, not painfully, but as a greeting, and spread its wings. Jasper walked to the edge of the arch. He watched the white speck of the owl receding, becoming a small dot against the background of the grey autumn sky and mountains covered in crimson. Below, far, far away, the black lake glistened. From here, from the height, the world seemed vast. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Jasper felt that he was not lost in this vast world. He was a part of it, a small, quiet, but integral part. He took a deep breath of the cold air, adjusted his scarf, and began to descend the spiral staircase, down to the warmth, to his friends, and to the herbology lesson, where, as Longbottom had promised, some particularly temperamental bushes that spat seeds were waiting for them. Jasper smiled. Bushes didn't scare him anymore. He had flown. The last week of September arrived at Hogwarts quietly, on soft paws, like a huge ginger cat deciding to warm itself in the autumn sun. The storm that had raged the previous week had subsided, leaving behind crystal-clear, transparent air and a sky of such deep blue that it was almost painful to look at. But the main change was the colors. If at the beginning of the month the Forbidden Forest had been a dark green wall, now it had burst into flame. Gold, bronze, copper, crimson. The trees had donned their finest robes, preparing for the long sleep of winter. In Gryffindor Tower, Sunday morning began not with the ringing of an alarm clock, nor the whistling of the wind, but with silence. It was a special Sunday silence, lazy, thick and sweet as golden syrup. Jasper woke of his own accord, without coercion. A sunbeam, breaking through a gap in the velvet curtains, fell onto his nose, tickling him with warmth. He didn't open his eyes for several minutes, simply enjoying the sensation of the soft feather bed, and the fact that today there was nowhere to run. No need to search for a herbology textbook, no need to fear being late for breakfast, no need to tremble before McGonagall's stern gaze. A creative mess reigned in the room, typical of 5 boys living together for a month. Issues of The Adventures of Martin Miggs, the Mad Muggle, which Ben had brought, lay on the floor, along with several chocolate frog wrappers, and, of course, socks. Jasper sat up in bed and stretched. His pajamas were soft and cozy. He looked at his bedside table. There, next to a glass of water and his wand, lay a pebble he had picked up by the lake yesterday, and a hippogriff feather given to him by Madame Roller, when they had accidentally met near the gamekeeper's hut. These were trifles, rubbish to an outsider's eye, but for Jasper, they were treasures, anchors that held him in this world. Oliver, in the next bed, snorted loudly and rolled over, muttering something about quaffles. Jasper smiled. A month ago, he would have been frightened, not knowing what to say to these boys. Now their snoring was the familiar soundtrack of his nights. He got up, threw on his dressing gown and walked to the window. The view from Gryffindor Tower was breathtaking. The whole world lay below, covered in a golden carpet of autumn. Far below, on the Quidditch pitch, small specks were flying. The Gryffindor team was holding a practice. Jasper pressed his forehead against the cool glass. He didn't want to be down there, in the wind, chasing balls. He liked being here, an observer in the high tower. When he finally descended to the common room, an atmosphere of relaxed idleness prevailed. The fire in the grate burned steadily and calmly, not roaring as it did on windy nights, but crackling quietly, as if telling a story. A few older students occupied the best armchairs by the fire, but they weren't studying. One boy was dozing with a book covering his face. 2 girls were knitting something with enchanted yarn that changed color on its own, and one of the Willoughby twins was trying to teach his small, fluffy Puffskein to do somersaults on the rug. "Is there still breakfast?" Jasper asked Ben, who was sitting on the floor building a house of cards, which constantly tried to explode because the cards were the same, exploding snap deck. "Yeah, until 11, Ben replied, carefully placing the Queen of Spades on the top. "But hurry up, Tommy said he saw sausage rolls on the table, and they disappear at the speed of light." Jasper didn't hurry. He knew. At Hogwarts, no one went hungry. He walked through the corridors to the Great Hall, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. He noticed that he no longer looked constantly at his feet, afraid of tripping. He looked at the portraits. "Good morning, young man," greeted Sir Cadogan, who today had decided for some reason that he was fishing, and was sitting on a painted riverbank with a fishing rod tangled in his own helmet. "Good morning, sir," replied Jasper. "Any bites?" "Not a one," the knight announced joyfully. "But this is strategic waiting. The enemy thinks I am asleep, but I am. Snore." He fell asleep right in mid-sentence. The great hall was light and airy. Sunbeams fell through the stained-glass windows, painting the flagstones in red, blue, and yellow. Jasper sat in his favorite spot, not in the center where it was noisy, but closer to the end of the table, from where the staff table was clearly visible. He helped himself to toast, scrambled eggs, and those very sausage rolls, which, fortunately, were still there. He ate slowly, spreading butter on hot bread, and watching it melt, soaking into the crumb. Eleanor Vane sat down next to him, the head girl, and probably the smartest girl in Gryffindor. She looked a little tired but satisfied, surrounded by thick tomes. "Hello, Jasper," she nodded to him, not looking up from reading numerology and grammatica. "How are you getting on with Transfiguration? I heard you managed the match." Jasper nearly choked on his juice in surprise. Eleanor Vane knew his name? And about the match? Yes, thank you," he mumbled. "A little bit. Only the tip." "That matters," she said seriously, finally raising her eyes. "The beginning is the hardest part. Most people give up when they don't see a result immediately. You didn't give up. That's the Gryffindor way." She returned to her book, and Jasper sat there, stunned. The Gryffindor way. Him? The boy who was afraid of heights and loved silence. But Eleanor's words warmed him better than hot tea. After breakfast, he decided not to go to the library. The weather was too beautiful to sit within four walls. He took his scarf, wound it around his neck. The red and gold stood out brightly against his black robes, and went out into the courtyard. Autumn was in full swing. Fallen leaves rustled underfoot. The maples were crimson, the oaks golden, and the whomping willow by the lake had already shed some of its leaves, its branches looking like thin fingers dipped into the water. Jasper found a large flat stone by the water's edge, warmed by the sun, and sat on it. He took a book from his pocket, not a textbook, but an ordinary storybook he had brought from home, The Hobbit. He was reading it for the third time, but he liked returning to familiar worlds. Here, by the lake, it was peaceful. Occasionally the giant squid would float past, lazily moving its tentacles. Sometimes students would run by, laughing and throwing leaves at each other. Jasper sat, reading about Bilbo Baggins's hole, and thought that the Gryffindor Common Room was somewhat similar to it. Just as round, warm, full of food and safety. But Bilbo went on a journey, and so had Jasper. Returning to the common room closer to evening, when the sun began to dip towards the sunset, painting the sky in violet and pink hues, Jasper realized it was time. Time for the big letter. He had written short notes, sent messages via school owls, but he hadn't yet written a real, long letter telling them everything. He found a quiet corner at a small escritoire by the window. It was a little cool from the glass here, but it helped him think. He spread a clean scroll of parchment before him, placed his inkwell, checking this time that it was stable, picked up his favorite quill. Dear Mum and Dad, it is Sunday today, and it is very sunny here. The leaves on the trees have turned completely yellow, like Mum's turmeric pies. I am writing to you from the common room. It is very beautiful here right now. The fire is burning, and someone is playing an enchanted guitar in the corner. I know you were worried whether I would find friends here. You know I'm not very good at, well, approaching people. But it turns out that in Gryffindor, you don't have to be the loudest to be noticed. I have friends. Oliver, who is always losing things, even more often than me, and Ben, who knows everything about Muggle comics, and Simon, who always makes us laugh. We live in the same room, and it is fun, sometimes noisy, sometimes we argue about who gets the bathroom first, but I like it. Mum, you ask about lessons. Transfiguration is difficult. Professor McGonagall is very strict. She turns into a cat, but I managed to make a needle. Not a whole one, only the tip. But she said I understood the essence. The essence is the main thing. And I flew. Dad, it wasn't as scary as I thought. When you leave the ground, it takes your breath away at first, but then you realize the wind is holding you. I won't be a Quidditch player, that's for sure. But I'm not afraid to look down anymore. I think a lot about why the hat sent me here. I'm not brave like Harry Potter. I don't charge at trolls. But yesterday Eleanor, that's our head girl, told me that not giving up is also the Gryffindor way. Maybe she's right. I didn't give up when the quill made blots. I didn't run away when I had to mount the broom. I just keep going. I miss you. I miss the garden, our evenings. But you know, I don't want to come home right now. I'm happy here. It's a strange feeling, as if I have two homes now. One there, with you, where it is quiet and calm, and the second one here, where it is noisy, where stairs move and cards explode, but where it is also warm. Love, your Jasper. P.S. Please, send more warm socks. I think there is someone in the castle who eats them. Jasper put down his quill and blew on the ink to dry it. He reread what he had written. The words seemed simple, but they were true. He neatly rolled the parchment into a scroll and tied it with a red ribbon. He wouldn't take it to the owlery today. It was already late. He would send it tomorrow morning, before breakfast. He just held the scroll in his hands, feeling its weight. It was the summary of his month. His victory. Evening descended on the castle like a heavy velvet curtain. Beyond the windows of the common room, darkness thickened, and now the panes reflected only the inner world of the room. The lights of candles, the glow of the fire, the moving figures of students. Students began to disperse to their dormitories. The first years were already nodding off. Oliver yawned so widely he risked swallowing his own head. "Let's go, Jasper," called Ben, gathering his cards. "Herbology tomorrow. Longbottom promised to show us how to repot mandrakes. They say they scream like banshees. Need to get some sleep." Jasper nodded. He stood up, took his letter, and walked to the stairs. But on the step, he stopped and looked back. The common room was almost empty. Only a few older students were talking quietly by the dying fire. The coals shimmered red, casting the last warm reflections on the portrait of Godric Gryffindor above the mantelpiece. The room looked so lived in. Worn rugs, soft armchairs, the smell of old wood and smoke. This place had seen thousands of boys like him, thousands of fears, thousands of letters home, thousands of first flights. And it had accepted them all, accepted him too. He went up to the dormitory. It was quiet and dark here, only moonlight breaking through the window, painting silver squares on the floor. He quickly changed, carefully placed the letter on the bedside table so as not to forget it, and dived under the duvet. The bedding smelled of lavender and freshness. Jasper drew the curtains. The dark red fabric cut him off from the rest of the world, creating a small, private space. He lay on his back, hands behind his head. He listened to the breathing of his friends, listened to heavy doors booming somewhere far away in the castle, listened to the wind, his old acquaintance, gently touching the walls of the tower. A month, just 1 month. He remembered himself on platform 9 3/4, small, terrified, ready to run away, and compared that to who he was now. He hadn't become a giant. He hadn't learned to shoot lightning from his eyes. But he had learned to turn wood into metal. He had learned to fly. Well, almost. He had learned to laugh when he lost at cards. And most importantly, he had learned to fall asleep in this huge, strange, magical castle without fear. I am a Gryffindor, he thought. And this thought no longer caused him surprise or doubt. It sounded simply like a fact, like the sky is blue and fire is hot. Perhaps bravery is not the absence of fear. Perhaps bravery is when you are afraid, but you turn on the light anyway. Jasper Thorne closed his eyes. Images floated before his inner gaze. Professor Longbottom's smile, the stern glint of McGonagall's glasses, the silver tip of the match, the letter with the red ribbon. Sleep came softly, like a warm tide. The first month was over. Ahead was October, Halloween, the first snow, Christmas. Ahead was life, and Jasper was ready for it. He took a deep breath, exhaled, and fell asleep, and Hogwarts, old and wise, guarded his dreams, as it had guarded the dreams of all its children for centuries. All was well. All was at home.